We want to talk a little bit about the lines, the differences that separate Arabs from Turks and Iranians.
Yeah, these are three different languages. And they're not only three different languages, but they belong to three different groups. They are totally unrelated languages.
Right.
Arabic is a Semitic language, related to Hebrew. Turkish is a Turco-Tatar language, related to Tatar and Mongol, and more distantly to Hungarian and Finnish. And Persian is an Indo-European language, related to the languages of India and more distantly to the languages of Europe. I mean, in Persian, father is Pedar and mother is Madar and brother is Biradar. That tells you to which language family it belongs. Kinship terms are basic.
So much for the claims of pan-Islam.
Yeah.
I mean,
you have these three languages, which, as I say, are not only different, but unrelated, except, of course, for the large vocabulary of Arabic loanwords in both, and a lot of Persian loanwords in Turkish.
That's a very important distinction.
Yes.
Fundamental, I think.
Yeah.
Again, at the risk of using the pronoun I and overusing it, I know something about these differences because I come from a mixed Arab and Persian ancestry. For those uninitiated, we know that my last name means the Persian. And my mother came from very, very long Arabic tradition. Her ancestors had been in Greater Syria and Lebanon for a very, very long time. But my great-grandfather on my paternal side had come from Iran in the 1850s. And my late and beloved mother always had a word or two about these Persians who came to her part of Lebanon. From afar, maybe to the uninitiated, these people have striking similarities, but we know they don't. We know they don't. We know that the Persians are completely sui generis in many ways, and we know that the Arabs are very different. We know the Turks are very different, and I know that one way of thinking about this, I learned from you, that it depends on whether you define Turkey as a European country or a Muslim country. It depends on where do you enter Turkey. And so what about these lines and differences?
Yes, well, most people from the Western world who go to Turkey go from the West, from Europe or America, and arrive in Istanbul. I first set foot in Turkey from the south. I had spent some time in Syria, and before that in Egypt. And my first experience of Turkey was in Ankara and other places around there, and later in Istanbul. And I think I may say, you're quite right, Fouad, that this has really shaped my perception of the country ever since, having come from the south and the past instead of from the west and the present.
Yes.
But there is another point which I think is important, the difference between the Turks and the Persians on the one hand and the Arabs on the other. It was the Arabs, of course, who created the great Islamic state and the great Islamic civilization from the 7th century onwards. But then, as we know, the Arabs lost control. They lost control of the civilization of the state which they themselves had created. And they became a subordinate element. And the Middle East was ruled or contested by non-Arabs, mainly Turks, and then from the 16th, 17th century onwards, Persians as well. Now, Turkey and Iran, Turkey and Persia, whichever you like to call it, are real countries in the European sense of that word. Let me explain what I mean. In Europe, there's a country which is called Denmark, inhabited by people called Danes who speak a language called Danish. There's a country called Spain, inhabited by Spaniards who speak a language called Spanish, and so on and so on. And their loyalty to their country is known as patriotism. That pattern does not apply anywhere in the Arab world, with the possible exception of Saudi Arabia, a very problematic exception. It does apply very clearly in Iran, and in a different way in Turkey. Iran is a country of great diversity of population. If you look around it, there are all sorts of ethnic minorities. There are Turks of various types. There are Arabs. There are Baluchis. There are Kurds. But they have a clearly defined common sense of identity. The difference is that in Iran, they have patriotism. In the Arab countries, they have nationalism.
That's a big difference.
It's a very big difference. You can't have patriotism where you don't have a clearly defined relationship with the country. In Iran, they are patriots. And the same is true in a somewhat different way in Turkey. We've been calling the country Turkey for 1,000 years. In Turkey, they only adopted the name after the First World War. This was a European name because it wasn't the local pattern. We think of, as I say, Denmark inhabited by Danish-speaking Danes, Turkey inhabited by Turkish-speaking Turks. It's obviously the same pattern. No, it isn't obviously the same pattern because they didn't see it that way. We have, for example, reports. I spent a lot of time reading diplomatic reports in both ways, including reports from Ottoman ambassadors who were sent to various places in Europe in the 17th, 18th centuries. And a recurring theme is they are angry and insulted when they are referred to as a Turkish ambassador. Because for them, at that time, Turk meant the peasants and nomads of Anatolia.
So they wanted to be Ottoman
ambassador,
right.
Or the ambassador of the Islamic Caliph.
Right.
Turkish was insulting. It's only in much more recent times that Turks have accepted to call themselves Turks. Previously, as I say, it was an ethnic term. It was not. It was a social term and a derogatory one. So in Iran, very much so. In Turkey, to a lesser but still very significant extent, you have patriotism as distinct from nationalism. And I think that that is a very, very important distinction. In the Arab world, the nearest approach to patriotism, I would say, is in Egypt. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with